Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Terry Yossi. I'm the President and CEO of the World Environment Center. We're a non-governmental organization that works with global companies to implement sustainable development in their business strategies and operations, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. Whether one is a specialist in Indian, U.S. bilateral energy issues or whether one's interests focus more broadly, I think you can't help but be impressed at the breadth and speed with which the U.S. India bilateral relationship has evolved just in the last 10 years. I think a decade ago we would have probably been focused primarily on strategic security issues in discussing U.S. India relationships. That was followed by a focus on developing a civilian nuclear agreement. With the President administration, Secretary Clinton very quickly established a strategic dialogue that encompassed not only economic and public policy related issues and security issues, but also questions concerning civil society. There are, of course, discussions underway regarding a model bilateral investment treaty. Very recently, Ambassador Rao made a comment publicly in which she said that technology and energy have become the new driving forces in the relationship between the two countries. And that brings us to today's panel that will focus on opportunities for bilateral energy sector trade. We're very, very fortunate in having a very distinguished panel of discussants who are going to illuminate various aspects of this topic. Let me just mention a word about how we're going to proceed in this first plenary session of the afternoon. We're going to have a keynote address from Ambassador Carlos Pascual. He will then be followed, and I believe you have some time to participate in the panel discussion that will involve 5 individuals, and I will introduce the panelists after the Ambassador's keynote address. So let's proceed into that topic immediately. We're very fortunate to have the Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs, Carlos Pascual, to lead this discussion in this session. I believe he's just very recently returned from India in the last day or so. Many of you know him because he's had a number of high-profile diplomatic assignments, including being the ambassador to Mexico, ambassador to Ukraine, but he's also served as the director of the Foreign Policy Studies program at the Brookings Institute. I had my first encounter with Ambassador Pascual at the Delhi Sustainable Development Summit several years ago, where after a very nice dinner that Terry had organized, we found ourselves on the bus going back to the hotel from the dinner, and I think we found the last seat that was available on the bus, and the last bus. So we had a very pleasant conversation, even though we had to scurry to catch the bus. So welcome Ambassador Pascual, who's going to talk to us this afternoon about cooperation on energy geopolitics.
So I was told that there were some slides that I was going to have that are, but I don't see them available to you. But I can make something up otherwise. If you I've got it, but it's not a problem of me making it up. It's whether you get the benefit of looking at them. So let me look at someone like Annapurna or somebody who can tell me from the conference organizers of whether there's going to be anything on the screen, and if there's not going to be, then I will stop pretending that there might be. So, all right. Well, in any case, I did just get back from India on Saturday evening or Saturday afternoon, and while I was there, we had an opportunity to engage with a range of government officials. One of the things that we've started with the Ministry of External Affairs is a bilateral exchange on energy security issues, which we run every 6 months or so. And we use it as an opportunity to also engage the Ministry of Energy, of Electricity, of New and Renewable Energy, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, the Ministry of Planning, and as well as a whole range of private sector actors. And it's based on some of these thoughts that I just wanted to share with you 3 sets of topics that and terrific. We have on the sides here the slides that I want to use to focus this discussion. So 3 sets of topics that I wanted to come back to, and in the discussion, I'm also going to pay a tribute to my friend and colleague David Sandlow, who was up to just a short time ago Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs at the Department of Energy and has been a stalwart on the India agenda, and I've learned a great deal from David and our work together. The first issue that I wanted to put in front of you is how we manage, how India manages this extraordinarily complex set of issues between energy investment requirements, commercial viability, the type of energy that it's going to use, and the commercial viability and the competitiveness of those energy sources. So let's start with the first point, which is that $1.62 trillion of needed investment in the power sector, including in generation and transmission and distribution, is estimated by the IEA through 2035. In order to get that, it's going to be critical to attract private investment. There's no way that this can depend simply on public funds coming into the in investing in specific technologies. In order to get that private investment, one of the critical units of analysis is going to be the commercial viability of power utilities. So one of the things that recently happened in India over the past 6 months is there was a rescheduling of about $35 billion worth of arrears that had accumulated in the power sector. There are 8 states that have stepped forward as lead entities in this commercial restructuring process. The ability to successfully handle this, I would submit, is going to be absolutely critical to attracting the levels and the type of private investment that's going to be necessary to succeed. So let me go on to the next slide. In the current 5-year plan that India is implementing, there is, as you see in that last little column on renewables, certainly a stronger push on renewables investment than we've seen in the past. But still, there is a projection for even a greater accumulation of coal-fired capacity in the overall generation capacity of the country. And if you look at how that gets translated into import requirements, it's indicating that India, a country which has consistently been able to supply enough coal, satisfy its needs, is going to be a more significant coal importer. It's importing coal now. That the percentage of coal that it will import will even increase into the future. So next slide. Now, this whole equation gets even more complicated if we try to take into account what is going to be competitive in the future. This slide was put together by some of my colleagues in my office. Coal has been at a base point of competitiveness of about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. But depending on what happens in future gas prices, we look at gas becoming increasingly more competitive, and solar will then at some point come into that competitive range as well. So how is this dynamic process going to be managed? And I would submit this, that at a center point of all of this, of all of these decisions, have to be the utility companies within India, because they are going to be fundamentally critical to establishing the commercial viability of the sector. They are going to be contracting for individual power sources. They are going to be the key factor that the private sector looks at on how they conduct their investment decisions. This is one area that we have raised as part of a potential dialogue between the United States and India. The Department of Energy, under David's leadership, has done phenomenal work on exchanging knowledge about different technologies and how to drive down the costs of those technologies. And the step that we want to continue to take is to combine the declining cost curves of those technologies to figuring out how to make them competitive, and based on whether they're competitive, then what kind of private investment might we see in the future. And that is fundamentally, I would submit, going to affect the nature of the power generation system of India and how renewable it is or it isn't. Right. Second question that I wanted to come to, the next slide, relates to natural gas. 3 maps here. The first is of the United States and the gas distribution network that we have in the U.S. That distribution network has been critical in taking advantage of the gas resources that we have and spreading them around the country. Second map you see at the bottom is on Europe. Europe has invested phenomenally in LNG regasification capabilities, in pipeline capacity, in making those pipelines move from west to east and north to south and not just east to west. And they've combined that with a whole series of competitive measures so that you can no longer own the gas, own the transit system, and own the distribution system. And from that has resulted a significantly changed competitive position where most of the Western European utilities have now renegotiated their contracts with Gazprom to reduce the price and extend the financing terms. All right. What you see in India is a much more limited extent of infrastructure. If we were to put up a map of Japan, surprisingly enough, it wouldn't look that different. It would have more regasification terminals, but very limited pipeline capacity. If we would put up a map of China, you would see a lot of LNG terminals on the coast and not a lot of pipelines beyond that. If there is to be a capacity to benefit from the kind of gas revolution that we're seeing around the world, and not just in the United States, but the increased supplies that we're seeing out of Australia and Mozambique and Tanzania and Norway and in the Mediterranean and potentially out of Russia, there's going to have to be a mechanism to not only be able to move that gas by LNG, but then have the terminals to be able to receive it, the distribution networks to be able to move it throughout countries, and the ability to be able to create a gas market. So the question that we have posed to India is, as friends and partners, do we want to work together on this? Do we work together as partners to understand what are the investments in infrastructure that need to be made? How much of that infrastructure investment might be made by the private sector? How much by individual countries? How much needs to be financed by multilateral banks? And how do you create the software of competition for that gas market in the future so that countries can be able to benefit from more competitive pricing? That is, I think, one of the most critical areas for cooperation that we might have looking to the long term between our countries. Final issue I'll put on the table, and if we can go to the next slide. And here, actually, I think one more slide. And here I want to go back to the issue that Aid Administrator Raj Shah was raising on the question of energy access and the importance of reaching the 400 million people who don't have access to power in India now. That number might actually be even higher. But again, I want to come back to this question of how do you create viable business models. If we go to the next slide for a minute, I would subject that if in looking at distributed power generation, that one of the things that we've got to be able to get right, or India has to be able to get right, is how to be able to combine financing for relatively small-scale investments together with the availability of technology at a localized level, combined with the service capability of that technology and the ability to ensure quality control. One of the things that we've learned is that contracts make a big difference. To the extent to which you have comparability in contracts and both your finance world and your technology world better understands them, you have the ability to bring banks and technology providers together. But we've got to be able to meet this challenge of understanding what is decentralized and where you can have benefits from a central resource base, what gets grant financed and what gets loan financed. Administrator Shah mentioned the importance of achieving partnerships. Last week, USAID was sponsoring a partnership meeting that had partners from all over, potential partners from all over the country participating in a dialogue. And let me go to the last slide here. And here's just one idea that might be able to be developed further. If we think about external financing coming into the country, how does it move more broadly to a network of participants who might be operating at a much smaller scale? One possibility is to have some form of development finance institution. It could be partly state. It could be cooperative of private entities. And that institution might, on the one hand, hold tenders to select partners, and those partners would come forward with proposals on how to combine financing, technology, and servicing of the technologies. And there may be, separate from that, the establishment of some form of centralized resource base that handles activities such as training of participants in the financial sectors, training of in information or in technology maintenance. That could be individuals who could be hired by the private sector. And beyond that, looking at issues such as, are there standard contracts that can be used? Are there standards that should be used in training to ensure that there's a minimum level of quality to which people are trained by? The reason I put this on the table is that if we can't figure out a viable business model to address this issue, this challenge of off-grid decentralized power generation, then it's going to be difficult to reach that level of 400 million people in India right now who currently don't have access to power. So I leave these with you as issues that are central in the bilateral relationship right now. We don't have answers to all of these things, but on these questions of the commercial viability of utilities and how they affect investment and the nature of that investment, the way that we can work together on the development of a regional gas market and its implications for competition, and the way that we can work together on the development of business models for off-grid decentralized power generation, we think are going to be critical factors in the overall character of the bilateral relationship, but our energy relationship as well. Thank you.
Since your words are so fresh in our minds, Ambassador Pasquale, I'm wondering if I could sneak in a quick moderator's question for you at this stage, and then we'll move on to our panel. You've done a great job of laying out some of the principal business and public policy decisions that are on the agenda for today between India and the U.S. And so many of these decisions are now being made in the context of a global energy marketplace. That's true even for commodities such as natural gas that have not historically been associated with a global market. And my question is, as you lay out this agenda of possibility, what could disrupt this policy and business agenda that you've laid out? What series of either technology or policy or political factors or geopolitical factors could disrupt the evolution of this agenda?
I think one of the most basic issues, I go back to where I started from in the discussion, is really what happens in the commercial viability of the power sector. Because if India is going to have to continue to generate over the next couple of decades, well over $1 trillion worth of private investment, if there isn't a perception of the commercial viability of the power sector, then it's just simply not going to attract the investment. In many ways, there are technologies that are available. There are options that exist on the importation of fuel sources to be able to fuel those technologies. There are renewable technologies that are available. But all of that is simply a theoretical exercise if there isn't the capacity to invest. And I just put that front and center again, because if we can't achieve that, then the rest of the agenda is going to be blocked. The other issue, which I think is absolutely key, is again this third question that I laid out, which is how to deal with disaggregated, decentralized power, because for much of India, it's going to have to depend on how it achieves the ability to bring power to the people without relying on a central grid. And maybe that grid will eventually get there, and maybe those people that have those single households that have solar panels on their roofs will be selling their individual power into a grid as a transmissional mechanism. Let's hope that that happens in the future. But for the near term, there has to be a business model that actually works. And so one of the things that we have found is a frustration. We mentioned this, I mentioned this in the discussion we had yesterday with the CEOs, is that nobody, even with microgrids, nobody wants to be the utility, right? Nobody wants to be that entity who is out there in the field trying to figure out, how am I going to collect revenue from all these people who are using my power? And we haven't figured out exactly yet, if you're working on a single household system model, how do you expand that to enough households to get the kind of cumulative impact and effect that's necessary to achieve a much broader access? And so this question of a business model for disaggregated, decentralized power is, I think, also going to be the other key part of the equation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce our panel members. First, is Mr. Deepak Amitabh, who is Chair and Managing Director of PTC India Limited. PTC India Limited was established in 1999 as a Government of India-initiated public and private partnership to focus on the development of commercially vibrant power market in India. To his left is Dr. Charles Ebinger, who is Director of the Energy Security Initiatives at the Brookings Institution. He is the author of many books, including Energy and Security in South Asia. We are also very pleased to have with us Mr. Henry Steingass, who is the Regional Director for South and Southeast Asia at the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. If you're not that familiar with the U.S. TDA, its mission is to create U.S. jobs through the export of U.S. goods and services for priority development projects in emerging economies. To his left is Venkatesh Velluri, who is Chairman and President of Ingersoll Rand India and a member of Ingersoll Rand's Global Senior Leadership Team. And Ingersoll Rand is a company that has rapidly advanced in its thinking and implementation of sustainable development initiatives, not only in India but around the world. Mr. Basant Jain was supposed to have joined us, but he's been called out of the room, so he will not be participating in this session. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to have a set of opening comments for about 3 to 4 minutes each, and then we'll proceed into general discussion. Please.
Respected panelists and ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The topic which has been chosen today for this session is opportunities for bilateral energy sector trade. I'd like to start with that what are the major challenges and opportunities in advancing bilateral energy sector trade between the two countries. We have been in the Indian power sector. We created the power market 2000-2001 and have seen the growth of IPPs, long-term contracts of IPPs, selling back-to-back contract to the people, collecting more than $40 billion worth of energy sale from the same utilities which are passing through difficult phase for last 2 years. And what the ambassador was talking about in his introductory remark, that there is going to be a restructuring package which is being worked out. So major challenges as well as key opportunity is that it is grossly under-penetrated market and over-regulated market. And therefore, interventions at both regulatory and capacity creation levels can free up a huge potential for bilateral energy sector trade. Now, what is the Indian power sector scenario as of now? India is struggling with an energy situation that can be best described as suppressed demand. There is so much of latent demand in the system. The universal supply obligation which is cast upon the distribution utilities today only amounts to giving connections. Power connections are given, but whether they are wired for 24 hours, there is no security. So it's a very, very latent demand type of system, and it is due to an inadequate grid and distribution network infrastructure. Second is what Ambassador had covered in his initial remark, distortions in primary energy and fuel pricing. Third one is evolving industry structure, coping with issues of pricing power and dominant position. And the fourth one is potential existence of stranded capacity along with unmet demand. So it's a very peculiar paradox which Indian power sector is going through, that there are generation units, there are people, whether at retail, whether at agriculturist, they all have been buying power, costly power through diesel generating set. So everyone has the buying capacity, but because there is a distribution utility concept and what he was talking about, that you'll have to go into not centralized, but you'll have to get into a smaller and smaller portion. Because people are willing to pay, generators are willing to supply. The pricing, if the pricing distortions which are because of fuel supply, which are administered prices, etc., they have got distorted. If they are corrected, I'm sure India will be a very, very, from a market perspective, very, very vibrant power market. Now, the US as a trade partner cannot hope for a more attractive opportunity. Whether it is across segments related to supply and security of primary fuel. We have talked about gas, which I've been hearing for last one day, requests from supply of gas. You will be very surprised that a lot of Eastern US companies who are sitting on coal deposits also, they have started approaching India, obviously high GCV, 6,000 plus GCV. Even if at a $40 per metric ton, the shipping cost, still they are able to reach the Indian shore at about $100. Then security of primary fuel. Then third was efficiency services, capital investment, information backbone creation, and knowledge transfer capacity building. So these are the areas which are for huge opportunity. And first round of grid capacity creation is in progress. Still, because India, Northeast, etc., the grids are not well connected. So the first round of grid creation is still going on. Then follow-up phase of R&M, renovation and modernization. Replacement of capital equipment in old plants is just round the corner, as the most robust performer plants are aging. So that again gives a tremendous opportunities with people who have the good technologies to come and do the R&M and improve the efficiency there. So in my opinion, timing is good for partnering India. Earlier movers will have an advantage because we are seeing signs of in-progress capacity hitting funding, fuel security roadblocks, complete lack of gas availability, and hence significant amount of peaking capacity is idling and will continue to idle. And third is early signs of difficulties in creating capacity based on new and renewable technology. So with this, I close my opening remarks and will be open for questions later on during the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be with you today. Particularly delighted to be on the program with Ambassador Pasquale, who is the man who hired me at the Brookings Institution 5 years ago and is a former colleague. I'd like to pick up on Ambassador Pasquale's comments because I think when one looks at opportunities for bilateral trade, the critical question is there a commercial market for this? And I would say, sadly, as one who's looked at this issue for many years, the answer is no. Because there are tremendous opportunities for bilateral trade, but in the absence of effective pricing, in the absence of creditworthy off-takers, these things sadly have not come to fruition and are unlikely to come to fruition until there is a much stronger regulatory sense, a much greater improvement in billings and collections for people that actually make investments in the power sector, a much greater effort to deal with the ongoing and tragic issue of power theft, that while great gains have been made, in reality in many state electricity boards still remains a major problem. I applaud all the things we've heard today, particularly from the USAID director, about what can be done in the rural areas, and Ambassador Pasquale and others have reiterated that what we need to do to bring the people with no electricity into the modern sector. But I caution that this is not enough, because if one looks at India, one sees massive urbanization, massive migration from the countryside. So while there is clearly an urgent need to help those that have nothing in the line of energy, there is also the need to plan for the modern India that is emerging and is likely to become even more energy intensive as populations shift from rural to urban areas. And of course, once they move to urban areas, people move away from traditional fuels that they may have in their village, biomass, dung, whatever, and move into commercial markets where they need kerosene, charcoal, LPG, etc. Now, just very quickly, in the interest of time, I'm just going to highlight some of the bilateral opportunities I see. To the north, you have a country, Nepal, 83,000 megawatts of power, 42,000 deemed commercially viable. I know there are plenty of arguments among some in the room that we shouldn't be building big hydropower for a variety of complicated reasons. But the tragedy is that for all these years, there has not been a serious project moving forward for a variety of reasons on both sides of the border. But a lot of it, I would argue, has been intemperance by Indian officials who want to keep power a separate issue, don't want to look at the added value Nepali hydropower would bring in issues such as irrigation and flood control, irrigation benefits, flood control, greater potability of water, and have systematically not allowed those issues to be tied to the question of the pricing of the electricity. To the west, tragically, one of the great coal resources in the world, albeit in one of the most difficult locations of the world, the Thar Desert down on the border of India and Pakistan, could, I think, if one looked seriously at it and looked at underground gasification, bring literally tens of thousands of megawatts into the Indian industrial heartland in Gujarat, which could then be moved beyond the states since Gujarat is relatively well off in electricity. But for obvious reasons, going back to historically and trust, has never come to fruition. There was great hope for many years about moving Bangladeshi gas into India, but while the Bangladeshis dithered on whether to use pipeline gas or LNG, and at the same time had ill-advised pricing policies, which have now led to a natural gas crisis in Bangladesh itself, these opportunities were squandered. There have been opportunities to move gas across Bangladesh from Myanmar. The Indians had the deal locked up. But too many successive commissions, investigations, parliamentary bodies, while they dithered on whether to actually approve such, the Chinese came and stole the deal away. And again, an example of too many bureaucracies in India still governing energy policy, and I would put that at the top of the reform agenda that India needs to do. Bhutan has been a great success story and likely to become more so. The first major hydroelectric project with Bhutan doubled the GDP of Bhutan and has been a great boon to the country, a great story on all sides. And finally, again in the interest of time, two major pipelines, natural gas pipelines that could offer great opportunity for both India and its neighbor Pakistan, the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline, which, of course, because of the international sanctions policy on Iran has been blocked. Not only does India desperately need the gas, as we have heard, Pakistan needs the gas even more, as it has an endemic natural gas prices with much more of its economy based on natural gas than that in India. And of course, if we can ever get Afghanistan stabilized, the Turkmenistan, Afghan, Pakistan, India pipeline, which all the countries need, if there's any hope for Afghanistan to ever be bolstered, it's got to have some energy sources which could be siphoned off along the pipeline route. And again, Pakistan and India are desperate. Lots of opportunities, all sadly historically lost for lack of political will, not only in India, but on other sides of the border.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm going to speak from here. I want to thank you for covering the waterfront of the regional geography so eloquently, and Carlos also for framing our discussion about the relevance of trade to the U.S. and India relationship. I will also try to be quite brief and focus on what Terry mentioned is the role of our agency, which is simply stated to promote U.S. jobs, but to do so through a development equation that's relevant, in this case, to India. And in the energy sector particularly, it's certainly a priority of our agency to promote the development, the modernization of infrastructure in India and other economies where we support such programs. But India is indeed one of the priority markets and country programs for our agency. And the energy sector is where we focus about half of our attention in each year. So I wanted to focus on a couple of themes that have resurfaced multiple times over the last day and look at the private sector part of that equation. The focus of our agency is working with sponsors in India who can bring modern solutions that would come ideally from the US, that's our mandate, to the India energy sector. And our partners have been both government and private sector. Increasingly, we're focusing on the private sector because of the ability that we see for uptake of modern solutions. And as we've discussed in this energy meeting, options that range from the very small scale to the microgrid and to the larger scale, looking at gas pipeline infrastructure and LNG imports. We're an agency, although small, we focus wherever those opportunities are and where we can promote that bilateral trade and an expanded trade between India and the US. So a couple examples. In the smart grid arena, we've heard quite a few mentions across the day. We have, in a short 2 years, sponsored programs with distribution utilities in 4 cities: Kolkata, North Delhi, Bangalore, and in Mumbai most recently. And in each of these cases, we're looking at utilities that are facing fairly significant distribution losses, transmission losses. Carlos had a nice slide showing some high percentages. But in general, what we've seen are private sector managed distribution utilities with lower loss profiles in percentage terms. Still, they see the potential for the ability to decrease those losses further and to squeeze more efficiency out of the system. And in the most recent program that we signed 2 weeks ago in Mumbai with Reliance Infrastructure, they manage a large part of the Mumbai distribution system. It's a demand-side management power system where they intend to actually measure the savings that this smart grid application will bring. And it's an indicator of the way in which we see the ability to replicate results working with a partner that we believe can have the ability to get such solutions deployed and approved. After we had signed the grant, they asked if we could introduce a third-party verification step for their approval of the milestones that would be performed by the U.S. contractor. The U.S. contractor, by the way, is contributing significant resources to this pilot program, as is Reliance Infrastructure. And the reason that they asked if we could support a third-party verification was they want to bring in the regulator, the Maharashtra state regulator, so that they can be convinced that the kind of solution that they believe will bring them savings and generate extra power can actually work, and to pave the way for its approval, basically adding it into the rate base. This to us was maybe not a revelation, but certainly a new concept. One reason we decided to work with this kind of partner was because of their standing and their ability to move deployment forward. So we're actually now looking at a new mechanism to use an Indian third-party verification mechanism to help pave the way for regulation. So in the smart grid arena, we certainly are looking at quite a portfolio, and there's much more to be had there, and clearly our PACE program that you've heard talk about, funded through U.S. aid, has a lot of cooperation underway with India, with India's smart grid network. Another area that we have invested, again, with private sector developers is in the solar arena. And here we've chosen to work with parties that have established track records getting megawatts on the grid in India through power sales agreements with state utilities, with sales to private entities under the National Solar Mission and outside the solar mission incentives. And what we are hearing back from one project in particular is the difficulty in establishing the resiliency of a PPA that could justify the financing needed for some period of time. This, I think, is no secret to a lot of people that there's been great successes in the India Solar Program, as well as some challenges that have multiplied in their variation across many states and the ways they have gone about these power sales agreements. But we do see continued opportunity for trade in that arena and are open to support that. But many have also talked about microgrid projects. We've supported a project with one of the participants in this conference, Azure Power, where they're looking at precisely the challenge of the business model, the payment schemes, the collection, the billing, as well as the deployment of a solar microgrid system and how you distribute that energy. So we do believe that those business models and the private sector solutions can help a lot in that arena. The last area I would touch on is the natural gas and the unconventional gas arena that both Charlie and Carlos mentioned. This is clearly a huge area of potential cooperation and U.S. India trade. When we brought a unconventional gas delegation to the U.S. Last summer from India, there was almost as much interest on the part of some of the companies that joined that mission to talk about investments in the U.S., both to take advantage of the natural gas, shale gas plays here, as to take technology to India for similar development, as there was for U.S. companies to talk about assisting in India with unconventional gas development. And the focus was certainly the new interest in, not so new, but certainly the big interest in shale gas, but we also were including coal bed and coal mine methane, because as many of you know, that's a strategy in India that has been endorsed through several rounds of concessioning. And this arena of gas development is a very big potential source of increased India-US trade, and not just the potential to sell LNG to India from our resources. And we are supporting that as well. We signed an agreement with SR, again, cost shared by the US partner and SR, to look at development of shale gas and oil resources in their concession areas. And the technology that many US drilling services companies and other experts in unconventional gas have developed here and continue to develop, because we all recognize the challenges that exist in the environment, both in terms of escaping methane emissions and the water resource challenges, are areas where we see great potential for India-US trade and where we also stand ready to support that kind of development. I'll leave it there. I know we are running a bit short on time, and I would like to turn it to Venkat, who represents another potential avenue that we have supported in India, which is to help bring private companies involved in the energy sector, US companies involved in India's energy sector, together such that they could be a voice to help promote some of the solutions and the regulatory treatment that could be used in India in the efficiency sector. Venkat?
Thank you, Henry. I represent Ingersoll Rand, so I'll quickly tell you about the successes what we've had, rather than delving on what policy changes need to be made. But before that, let me also kind of talk about a quick comment which one of the chief ministers made to me a few weeks ago in one of the northern states. And he said, you know what, Mr. Valluri, we're going to build 20,000 megawatts over the next 3 years in our state. And I said, really? He said, yes, we're actually going to build 20,000 megawatts of power generation in our state over the next 3, maybe up to 5 years, but we will have 20,000 megawatts. Now, you would tend to kind of hear these statements time and again across the country from a number of political leaders that, that this kind of an investment is going to come in, and, the country is going to be self-sufficient in power. And most businesses have actually learned to live with these, but yet you've got to make your businesses successful, So there is one area I was saying that, India will be coal sufficient, will be able to import coal, will be able to get gas, will be able to kind of drive hydro generation, which are all long-term prospects, 10, 15, 20 years, by which time these things kind of get into fruition and you actually start seeing benefits coming out. But then there's a short term where you really need to look at how are you going to leverage what can be done. I believe that there are two areas clearly in India which can actually drive. One is clearly the microgrid piece. I think there is an immense opportunity in microgrid in India. Similarly, on smart grids, there's going to be an immense opportunity because these are not really dependent on a number of factors. And I take the telecom example. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when you looked at the Indian telecom wireless industry, you had probably 10 to 15 million people owning telephone handsets. In 10 years, you had 800 million people owning. So there was actually a push from the society, from the users, to actually drive policy, and not the other way around, to make a policy and drive market. I don't think so that works in India. When you actually have demands coming from the market, then the policy gets driven. So exactly in the same way, I believe that in the future, the way the power energy sector is going to drive is going to be through a process and a solution network where you see the demand being driven from users who are saying that there are very cost-effective solutions which can actually be applied. So how do you do that? And therefore, I kind of believe there are two areas which I think there's a huge amount of opportunity in terms of bilateral trade and actually driving business across the two countries. One is innovation and technology. And from our experience, what we have seen, at least as Ingersoll Rand, and I think I quoted this example last time and I will quote this example again, is really the food security, where we realize that there is no grid power in the villages, but we need to drive cold chain using battery technology, which is exactly what we did. So when we did that, initially when we actually launched these programs using on small vehicles, we realized that we can actually drive a whole lot of volume of business in the country by getting into rural sectors or small towns and cities. So we actually built a technology in India which is devoid of technology which was not available, or devoid of services or power which was not available. So similarly, I do think that microgrid or individual houses actually driving their own power solution is going to be a potentially very, very high business using solar or, equivalent technologies. The other area is really the whole energy efficiency piece. So there is a certain amount of energy that is being used across buildings in the country. Now, how can we bring in technology and innovation to actually minimize the energy utility? Now, today, we are actually not only driving energy efficiency in the country, but what we have done is we've partnered with someone like IBM, where we actually bring in data analytics. We actually start showing how energy can be saved. Now, again, this is at a cost point, at a price point, which is relevant to that market, where organizations get together, drive analytics, and actually start showing how energy can be saved. So there is, to me, there are two or three areas which I think can drive really bilateral business proposals. Drive technology, drive innovation. Look at innovation which will really impact societies, but really at price points which are not only just relevant for an emerging economy, but can be actually relevant for the rest of the world. The longer-term solution of saying whether we can have gas-based power plants, whether we can have hydropower plants, whether we can have coal-fired power plants, is really a long-term solution. That's not a 2-year solution or 1-year solution. The infrastructure needs to be built. It's a 10, 15, 20-year solution. So I think the strategy of bilateral trade, of driving business, will be A, short-term, and B, long-term. So I think that's the way I do believe that this whole relationship can actually improve pretty strongly in the short term and in the long term. Thank you.
I know there are many issues that are still to be explored in this panel discussion, but I believe in the interest of allowing the subsequent panel to also have some time for speakers to present their remarks, I'm going to draw this session to a close, but let's give a very enthusiastic thank you to each of our panelists.